2024 is on track to be the warmest year on record, and the spate of extreme weather events happening across the globe keep reminding us that we really need to step up climate action. But to do that, especially in the developing countries, we need climate finance. So, where is that money going to come from? Now, this year's climate change conference happening in Baku is going to delve upon some of these questions. The UN Climate Summit, COP29, is going to be held in Baku, Azerbaijan from 11th November to 22nd November. And today we have with us Ms. Avantika Goswami from Center for Science and Environment, who's going to help us understand why this UN Climate Conference is important for us. Avantika, welcome to CNN News 18.
Thank you, Shishti. Happy to be here.
Yes. So, Avantika, I'll start off with the main question. These climate change conferences happen every year. Why is COP29 important? Why do these talks at Baku matter for us?
So Shishti, there are people who are talking about so many global events happening right now. The US election is coming up. There are conflicts going on around the world. It seems like it's a very busy time for the world. But despite that, this climate summit that's going to happen next month in Baku is being touted as the most important climate conference since the Paris Agreement of 2015. And why is it so significant? Because it's all about money. So finance is going to be the key focus at COP29. And this has been a long process. This is not something that has come up suddenly. In the Paris Agreement, which is the world's current governing greenhouse gas reduction treaty, which was signed in 2015, the Paris Agreement wrote in its decision text that countries will work towards determining a volume of climate finance that must be transferred from developed to developing countries by 2025. And there's a bit of history to this, but before I get into that, I think it's important to highlight the importance of climate finance itself. So essentially, climate finance is money that goes towards specifically infrastructure projects or social and related urban as well as national level projects that go towards meeting climate needs. So this could be projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions or projects that help to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So mitigation and adaptation projects. Now, most of the money that's being spent on these projects currently is being raised by countries domestically, so through domestic sources of financing. But this is not good enough because many developing countries like India, for example, our union budget does have some climate relevant headers in the past few years, but our limited budget has many different development priorities. Similarly, other smaller, poorer countries have even more competing priorities in their domestic budgets. So this is where international climate finance plays a role, where developed, wealthier countries who emitted most of the greenhouse gases over the past 100 years are really required as an obligation to pay climate finance to developing countries. So that's what makes climate finance very important. It's the money that makes climate mitigation and adaptation possible. And those things are really the need of the hour as the climate crisis is getting worse.
Essentially. So just to explain to our viewers, mitigation is when we are trying to control the emissions which are making the global temperature spike. And like you said, adaptation is also essential because we have to adapt to these impacts which are really increasing. Avantika, so when we talk about money, we remember this $100 billion which was pledged by the developed countries, but it hasn't really come through. So when we talk about this new climate finance aspirations, the new goal that is likely to be set up, what are the timelines we are looking at? What does this goal really look like? How much money are we talking about?
So prior to 2009, in the climate conferences that used to happen before that, there was never really a number, a dollar figure put on the table about how much money there were discussions that developed countries should pay some kind of, climate reparations almost to correct past wrongdoing of emissions to developing countries. But 2009 was when this number of $100 billion annually was casually put on the table by developed countries. It was not really backed by any kind of great needs assessment or assessment of how much money is available and so on. And that kind of got written into the COP outcomes in subsequent years, that rich countries will transfer $100 billion per year as climate finance to developing countries. Unfortunately, in the accounting that was done year after year, the number for the actual climate finance transferred never came up to 100 billion for the years after 2009. Only recently in 2022, was the total amount of climate finance that was being transferred every year, did it cross 100 billion? So in 2022, developed countries showed $116 billion in their climate finance accounting. And this accounting is also quite questioned. There's definitely some projects that get financed in the name of climate, which actually may not be going towards climate needs at all. So what happened at the time of determining the Paris Agreement is that developing countries pushed for an upward revision of this 100 billion. Let's negotiate on a new target after 2024 that is actually taking into account what are the costed needs of achieving the climate goals of developing countries. And that's where this new climate finance target has come into the conversation. And the process was put in place that over the past 2 years, very detailed technical discussions, political discussions have been had by country governments, by scientists, by NGOs and academia to really gather all the possible knowledge required to inform what this new target should look like. So this is what is going to be negotiated at COP29 in Baku. It's going to be a tough fight because, as we all know, country governments hesitate to spend money on most, domestic purposes, let alone transferring money to some faraway country to implement climate action there. But it is the need of the hour given the escalating nature of the climate crisis. So that's what we are heading towards Baku with. In terms of how much money is being put on the table, there are various needs estimations. So, through the Paris Agreement process, countries have created these climate plans. India, for example, has created a climate plan called these climate plans are called NDCs, or Nationally Determined Contributions, under the Paris Agreement. So, for example, India has pledged that it will have 50% non-fossil installed power capacity by 2030. Now, for many countries who have made these climate plans, they have put in a costing estimate of how much money is going to be needed to help them achieve these plans. So one of the latest estimates from the UN itself, in collating all of these costing estimates from different countries, almost like, countries give their money requirement and somebody sums up that total. An estimate has been found to be about $400 to $500 billion per year. But this is only an estimate for a handful of countries, not even all developing countries. So many developing countries are demanding a figure closer to $1 trillion per year from developed countries to flow towards all developing countries. So that's kind of the ballpark that we're looking at. Of course, the reality of these political negotiations will be a little different. We'll see what finally gets agreed upon in Baku.
Okay, it may be too far-fetched, but which are the countries which are going to benefit from this climate finance? If you could give us a larger picture.
So, that is something that is difficult to predict. There are estimations available of where climate finance goes in terms of recipient countries. Definitely the developing countries who are trying to present a united front in Baku, because, you need those numbers when you're dealing with, behemoths like the US and the European Union. developing countries are asking for the money to flow to all developing countries. Don't identify a narrowed down number of countries who should receive this climate finance. But there are requests for special consideration of, let's say, African countries, the least developed countries, such as, Afghanistan and so on, as well as the small island states who are probably facing the biggest existential threat from the climate crisis. So there are discussions
Right.
for special considerations to be given to some country groups, but the demand overall is that all developing countries should get some share of this climate finance.
Yeah. So here I'm going to ask you, so what is India's role here at COP29? What are India's expectations, especially as, a voice of the global South? How do we see this COP29 playing out for the country as a whole?
So India has a unique position in that we are a developing country, a very, very climate vulnerable country. And India is also a large growing economy. So definitely there are some eyes on India in terms of, thinking about, will India sometime become a contributor of climate finance in the coming years, not immediately, but maybe in the coming years. But at this point, India is very much in need of climate finance as a recipient. One thing that India has done, which is extremely vital in this process. So, these are political negotiations and no one wants to blink first. Everyone wants to kind of assess, how far they can push their demands with the other side on the negotiating table. So India went pretty early in the process and put a number on the table. They said, transfer $1 trillion per year in climate finance to all developing countries. This is very significant. I think it really shows that India was willing to put itself out there, play a leading role, and really invite developed countries to come to the table and negotiate on a number like that. So I think in that sense, India's presence really adds heft to these conversations, especially as a vital part of two big negotiating blocs. India is, of course, a part of G77 in China, which is the biggest bloc of 134 developing countries. India is also a part of the LMDC negotiating bloc at COP, the like-minded developing countries, which is a small group of pretty powerful emerging economies who have been making some very strong statements lately. So definitely India's presence in these conversations adds some weight to push forward the arguments and demands from developing countries.
Right. And like we saw how the discussions played out at G20 last year. So India would be really looking forward to what happens really at COP29. Avantika, now the major question. We discussed all these issues, but clearly there are challenges. It's not going to be an easy road. So where do we stand today now? COP29 is just 2 weeks away. And so what are the issues here that, that could prove to be challenging? What are the positions for countries now?
So I'll break this up into two parts. The first is speaking about developing countries, and then we'll talk about the developed countries. So for developing countries, the biggest, I think, challenge and requirement is that they remain united in their demand. That's what we saw happening in Egypt in 2022, when the Loss and Damage Fund was won after a 30-year battle, because the G77 and China bloc remained united in their common demand. Developed countries were not able to break up the G77 and, kind of weaken their position. So what's happening right now is within the G77, because there's such variation between country positions, what India wants is quite different from, let's say, what some island states want. Maintaining that unity is going to be very crucial. Only then can they really push with a lot of urgency and pressure for the demands that they have. The other hand, the developed countries, I think the biggest challenges are going to be preventing developed countries from distracting from what the task at hand is. And believe me, there are many, many distractions up their sleeve. The question of who should pay climate finance, contributor-based, that's being used as a very clear distraction because, countries like the European Union, US, and similar, G7 adjacent countries are saying that many formerly developing countries like China and the Gulf states, they are now quite wealthy, so they should start paying into climate finance as well. To be very honest, these are not constructive discussions at this point. It's only an attempt to distract from the responsibility of these countries to really pay, which is US, EU, similar G7 countries. So we have to be aware of distractions. There's also a conversation ongoing on the role of the private sector. And I think this has to be handled very carefully. We have to understand that, yes, within various countries in their domestic strategies, the private sector is very active. India, for example, is seeing a boom in private sector involvement in renewable energy, in electric mobility, and so on. But here we are at a UN forum where there is an opportunity to really bargain for the best possible outcome, and not an outcome that's going to be left to the whims of the global markets. So developing countries are clearly demanding, make international public finance the majority component of this new climate finance target. Have the biggest chunk of money be committed from governments of developed countries, because then you have certain accountability mechanisms in place, you have certain transparency, some predictability. But developed countries are trying to push the onus that private sector is going to pay for this. And that's tricky because private sector investment decisions are driven by where the profits are and where the returns are. And in climate investments, climate action, currently returns are not predictable. If you're talking about mature sectors like renewable energy, electric mobility, certain industrial sectors, maybe there is some guaranteed return. But other sectors like adaptation, loss and damage, they require public investment. So this public versus private debate is going to play out in an interesting way. And I think we should keep our eyes on that to make sure that the best possible outcome is achieved that guarantees some predictable flows of money to developing countries.
Definitely. So it's all going to be about the money at COP29. What is the climate finance flows going to be like? What are the points of contention between countries, like just like Avantika told us? But there are a lot of issues which are at stake here at COP29, and especially that next year is the timeline for setting up the updated nationally determined contributions from different countries. All this will depend on how much climate finance that COP29 really comes through. Avantika, thank you so much for sharing these insights with the viewers of CNN News 18. And we look forward to the discussions at COP29.